At 6 a.m. on November 15, 2012, the Stark County Sheriff's Office in rural Pennsylvania received a report of a particularly gruesome industrial accident at a private brickyard in Red Creek Township. The victim was identified as John Peterson, 38, the owner of the brickyard. According to the report from the victim's wife, Brenda Peterson, 34, while operating the brick extruder machine, John had accidentally slipped and fallen in. He was caught by the machine's auger, which mangled the upper half of his body, killing him instantly. County Sheriff's deputies, including the Detective Division and the Forensics Unit, quickly arrived to investigate. The scene was a rustic brickyard, sheltered by a makeshift tin roof, with damp, slippery ground. The brick extruder, a massive, old industrial machine in the center of the yard, had its power cut. The clay hopper of the machine was caked with blood and crushed bone and tissue fragments. John Peterson's body was wedged tightly in the mouth of the hopper from the abdomen up. He had been pulled inside and completely disfigured, creating a horrific sight. At the scene, Brenda Peterson and a hired hand named Leo Martinez, 25, were being consoled by deputies. Both were in a state of panic. Brenda was weeping uncontrollably, repeatedly recounting the story between sobs. She stated that early that morning, her husband had gone out to the yard to work first, as usual. About an hour later, she followed and was horrified to discover the scene. She screamed and called for Leo, who was working near the kilns, to come over. Then, they both ran to call for help. Leo Martinez's statement fully corroborated Brenda's. Initially, the incident appeared to be a tragic workplace accident. The brick-making trade was inherently difficult and fraught with risks. The old extruder, lacking modern safety guards, operated in a damp, slippery environment. The scenario of a worker accidentally slipping and falling in was entirely plausible. When questioned, neighbors also confirmed that John was a very hard-working man who often had the habit of climbing onto the hopper's edge to use a shovel or his feet to push clay down when the machine jammed. Several even recounted witnessing him narrowly escape being pulled in on a few occasions. However, when experienced forensic investigators from the state police arrived and began the on-site examination of the body, the first anomalies emerged, raising suspicions. First, the condition of the body. Although the call came in at 6 a.m., when the examiners checked, they noted that signs of rigor mortis had already set in several parts of the body, particularly the small joints. The victim's body temperature was also very low, ice cold. Based on their experience, the examiners determined that the time of death had to be at least 6 to 8 hours prior around midnight the previous night, not in the early morning as the wife had claimed. Second, the blood evidence at the scene. The blood spattered on the hopper and the ground around the extruder had turned a dark brown color, showing signs of coagulation and drying in many places. If this had been a recent accident, the blood would have been fresh, red, and liquid. The change in the blood's color indicated it had been exposed to the air for a significant period, once again reinforcing the assessment that the victim had died the night before. And the third, and most crucial, anomaly. Upon close inspection of the extruder's hopper, an area that was always coated in slippery clay, investigators found no traces of scrapes, claw marks, or signs of slipping. As a natural reflex, a person facing a deadly threat, especially being pulled into a machine, would struggle desperately, their hands trying to claw and grip the sides of the hopper to escape. The complete absence of these marks was extremely illogical. It pointed to a terrifying possibility. The victim was already unconscious or unable to resist when he was put into the machine. These three major points of suspicion instantly transformed a workplace accident into a deliberately and elaborately staged homicide. Law enforcement immediately changed the direction of the investigation. The tragic workplace accident had officially become a case of murder and disposal of a body. And the only two witnesses, the first two people at the scene, Brenda Peterson and Leo Martinez, were now the primary suspects. Faced with the irrefutable anomalies at the scene, a special task force was immediately formed by the Pennsylvania State Police, led by Detective Sergeant Frank Miller, a veteran investigator. Recognizing this as a sophisticated case of murder, body disposal, and staging a fake scene, the entire brickyard was placed under strict lockdown to continue the forensic examination and collection of microevidence. All production was halted, leaving only the tense atmosphere of the investigation and the eerie silence of the brick extruder, the case's main exhibit. The two primary suspects, Brenda Peterson and Leo Martinez, were immediately separated into different rooms for questioning. At the sheriff's office, both maintained a suspiciously firm demeanor. Brenda continued to play the role of a grieving wife who had just lost her beloved husband, crying pitifully, rambling about John's hardworking and gentle nature, and insisting she knew nothing about the deeper cause of the incident. She repeatedly offered baseless theories that her husband might have had business conflicts and was harmed by an enemy, attempting to steer the investigation away from herself. Meanwhile, in another interrogation room, Leo Martinez appeared overly simple and honest. The young man repeatedly stated that he was just a hired hand, indebted to his employers, and had only run over from the kill area when he heard the boss's wife screaming. Leo's testimony was articulate and clear, without a single extraneous detail. But this very perfection was an anomaly. Faced with such a horrific tragedy, a normal person would show confusion and panic in their retelling. Leo, however, was strangely calm, as if he had memorized a script. The almost absolute consistency in their stories, despite being separated, further strengthened the task force's belief that they had colluded and prepared their story beforehand. Realizing that direct interrogation at this point would be fruitless, Sergeant Miller decided to pause the questioning and shift to a second line of inquiry, one that required more patience and subtlety, to clarify the true relationship between the suspects and to find a motive. The most experienced detectives were ordered to quickly verify the backgrounds, social and financial relationships, and especially to dig deep into the complex love triangle between John, Brenda, and the hired hand, Leo Martinez. Information from neighbors, business associates, and even the victim's relatives was quickly gathered. And a backstage story, full of conflict, of the brickyard owner's family slowly began to emerge. A story far different from the happy facade they presented to the world. In the eyes of everyone, John Peterson was a man so simple he was almost rustic. He was not eloquent or skilled in communication. His entire life revolved around his work, clay, and bricks. He loved his wife and child dearly, handing over all the money he earned for his wife to manage without question. But his tragedy lay in this very gentleness and a past incident. A few years prior, while repairing a kill, he had fallen from a height. Although he survived, the after effects were severe. His physical health declined, and more importantly, the accident had seriously affected his virility. In complete contrast to her husband, Brenda Peterson was a woman in her prime, 34 years old. She was attractive, a smooth talker, and skilled at managing both the household and the brickyard's business. But behind that facade, many discerning people noticed that Brenda was a woman with high needs, somewhat flirtatious, and always seemed to dominate her husband. John's decline in masculine ability had turned their marriage into an empty shell. Brenda frequently expressed dissatisfaction, nagging and scolding her husband over trivial matters. Her contempt for his simple, submissive nature became increasingly apparent. And then the third character appeared, a fateful catalyst. Leo Martinez, a young man in his early 20s, originally from out of state, had drifted here looking for work. Leo had nothing but his physical strength. He was tall, muscular, with skin tanned by the elements, and possessed a phenomenal work ethic. He alone could do the work of 2 or 3 other men combined. Thanks to this diligence and brawn, Leo quickly earned the favor of John and Brenda, who treated him like family. He was not only paid a higher wage but was also often invited to stay for dinner, sharing a few drinks and conversation with the boss after a hard day's work. It was this seemingly harmless proximity that created the perfect environment for a spark to ignite a flame. During those dinners, with a little alcohol in the mix, flirtatious glances began to be exchanged between the boss's wife and the young hired hand. Brenda, in her dissatisfaction with her husband, saw in Leo a perfect compensation, a strong body and youthful vitality that her husband no longer possessed. And Leo, a young man far from home, could not control his desires when faced with the implicit invitations of an attractive boss in the bloom of her life. And then, the inevitable happened. One late summer evening, about a year before the murder, John happily announced he had just sold 2 large kilns of bricks, turning a handsome profit. To celebrate, he organized a small feast at home. The guests were just 3 people: himself, his wife, and Leo Martinez. John, in his joy and the innocence of an unsuspecting husband, drank heavily. He repeatedly toasted Leo, patting him on the back and praising him for his hard work. By late night, John was so drunk he passed out on the living room floor, sleeping like the dead. Their young child had been put to bed early. The house fell silent, leaving only Brenda and Leo sitting across from each other amidst the remnants of the meal. Alcohol and lust made the air thick with tension. After a moment of silence, Leo, emboldened, sidled up closer, his large hand resting on his boss's thigh. Brenda Peterson did not pull away. She just glanced at her husband lying motionless on the floor, then turned to look at Leo, her eyes a mixture of fear and invitation. She said nothing, only subtly nodding her head towards the bedroom. That was all the signal Leo needed. He stood up, swept the vibrant woman into his arms, and carried her straight into the master bedroom. And that night, on the very bed of the husband sleeping soundly just a few feet away, the sin began. That first tryst shattered all remaining moral barriers. It was not just physical gratification, it was a silent declaration of a sinful alliance, one that defied all consequences. From that night on, the relationship between Brenda and Leo became increasingly bold and reckless. They no longer limited their liaisons to the house but began meeting outside. Brenda's trips to the market for supplies became longer. Leo's requests for leave to visit his hometown became more frequent. Their destinations were usually cheap, roadside motels in neighboring townships. They believed that in those unfamiliar places, no one would recognize them. But sin, no matter how well hidden, will one day be exposed. The illicit affair of Brenda Peterson and Leo Martinez continued in the shadows for nearly a year. They grew increasingly reckless, believing that John's gentle, submissive nature was a safe shield, allowing them the freedom to do as they pleased right behind his back. But the truth will always find a way out. The reality of their affair was finally exposed by a cruel twist of fate, and the person who discovered it was one of the victim's closest friends. One afternoon in August, about 3 months before the murder, Dave, John's childhood friend and a close business associate, had to go to a neighboring township on business. While waiting for a friend at a roadside diner, he happened to witness an unbelievable sight. From a shabby motel across the street, a man and a woman emerged. He immediately recognized the man. It was Leo Martinez, the strong young worker from his friend's brickyard. But the woman walking beside him, laughing and affectionately linking her arm with Leo's, made Dave freeze. It was Brenda Peterson, his friend's wife. Stunned and disbelieving, Dave quickly took out his phone, pretending to take a picture of the scenery but actually capturing proof of the cheating couple. The image of them leaving the motel together was saved in clear detail. Rage swelled within him. He could not accept his best friend being so blatantly betrayed. Without a moment's hesitation, Dave immediately called John. Dave asked urgently where John was, telling him to drop everything and get over there immediately because he needed to show him something serious. Hearing the emergency in his friend's voice, John quickly rode his motorcycle to the meeting point. When he arrived, Dave did not say much, just showed him the photo on his phone. Seeing the image of his wife and his trusted employee coming out of a motel together, John's simple face turned pale, then purple with rage. He clenched his fists, the veins on his hands bulging as he roared about the bastard and the cheating whore. It was the first time anyone had seen him so furious. Dave asked what he wanted to do now, whether he wanted to go in there and settle it, ready to back his friend up. But contrary to his friend's expectation, after the initial burst of rage, John slowly collapsed onto a stone bench. He held his head in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. The fury was quickly replaced by a profound pain, the helplessness of a betrayed man. He did not think about confronting them or making a scene. The first thing that came to his mind was his young child. He was afraid that if everything blew up, the family would be shattered, and his child would suffer the most. His gentle, almost pitifully submissive nature was deeply ingrained in him. John said in a hoarse voice to let it go. He reasoned that making a scene would just bring shame on the whole family and only hurt his kid. He told his friend to just delete the picture and that he would go home and handle it himself. With that, he quietly stood up, got on his motorcycle, and left, leaving his friend sitting there, feeling a mixture of pity and anger at his friend's weakness. That night, the atmosphere in John's home was heavy as lead. He did not yell, he did not hit. He just called his wife into the bedroom, closed the door, and showed her the picture his friend had sent him. When Brenda Peterson saw the irrefutable evidence, she completely broke down. She could no longer deny it. She fell to her knees at her husband's feet, weeping pitifully. She swore and begged, blaming her loneliness, blaming the young man's seduction. She promised to break it off completely, to never do it again, pleading with him to forgive her for the sake of their child. And once again, John's weakness won. He chose to forgive his wife. But he also knew he could not keep a snake in his own house. His only demand was that Leo Martinez be fired immediately. The next morning, John called Leo out, paid him his final wages, and told him bluntly why he was being let go. He demanded that Leo leave the brickyard and never come back. Leo Martinez did not argue. He quietly packed his things and left. John was too trusting of his wife's tears and vows. He believed the storm had passed and his family would return to its former peace. He had no idea that his act of forgiveness had not reformed his unfaithful wife but had instead planted in her heart an even deeper contempt. To Brenda, her husband's weakness was a tacit permission, an assurance that she could continue her wrongdoing without paying the price. And indeed, after a short period of quiet, seeing that her husband completely trusted her again, Brenda Peterson proactively contacted Leo Martinez. Their clandestine affair resumed, but this time, it was even more secretive and sophisticated. They no longer met at nearby motels but sought out more distant, discreet locations. And then, the final tragedy struck on that fateful night. On the evening of November 14th, John had to go to a neighboring community to discuss business, saying he would be back late. This was the golden opportunity Brenda had been waiting for. She immediately called Leo Martinez and told him to come to the house. Their young child was fast asleep. The large house was empty except for the adulterous couple. They embraced, making love in the very house, on the very bed of the husband who was working hard outside. But fate had a cruel twist. John's business meeting was unexpectedly postponed. He decided to return home earlier than planned without calling ahead, perhaps wanting to surprise his wife. And as he gently opened the door and stepped inside, what greeted him was not a pleasant surprise but a harsh, devastating truth. He heard strange sounds coming from the bedroom. The instinct of a betrayed man took over. He tiptoed to the door and then threw it open. The scene before him was even more horrifying than the photograph. His wife and the hired hand he had once taken in were naked and entwined on his own bed. This time, there was no hesitation, no submissiveness. The repeated betrayal, the blatant disrespect, transformed the gentlest of men into a wounded beast. A primal roar of jealousy and pent-up resentment exploded from him as he screamed that he would kill them both. He could think of nothing else. He ran to the kitchen and grabbed a gleaming meat cleaver. A horrific chase and struggle began, ending only when John collapsed to the floor with a fatal knife wound deep in his abdomen. His last drop of blood was shed, putting an end to a tragic marriage and beginning a plan to dispose of the body that was even more monstrous. The fatal stab wound ended John Peterson's life, but it also thrust the two killers into a situation that was completely out of control. The murder was not part of their plan, it was a spontaneous act, an unforeseen consequence of being caught in the act of adultery. A deathly silence enveloped the bedroom, broken only by Leo Martinez's heavy breathing and Brenda Peterson's fearful whimpers. John's body lay in a growing pool of blood on the floor, his eyes wide open, a silent accusation. After his murderous frenzy, Leo Martinez began to tremble violently. He dropped the bloody knife, backing away, staring at the corpse in absolute horror. He had killed a man. He had killed the boss who had once taken him in. The fear of prison, of the death penalty, began to consume the young man's mind. He slumped into a corner, holding his head, not knowing what to do. It was in this moment of chaos and despair that Brenda Peterson's true nature was fully revealed. While her lover was panicking, this woman, after a few initial moments of shock, quickly regained her composure with a terrifying calmness. She did not cry, she did not scream. In her mind, fear was swiftly replaced by cold calculation. Her husband was dead. What was done was done. The issue now was not regret, but how to get away with it, how to turn this tragedy into an opportunity. Brenda ordered Leo to get up. Her voice was firm and cold, without a tremor. She told him that crying would not solve anything and asked if he wanted to rot in prison, because they would both be dead if they called the police now. Leo looked up, his eyes filled with desperation, and asked what they should do. Brenda glanced at her husband's body, then her gaze drifted out the window towards the dark silhouette of the brickyard, and a horrific disposal plan formed in her mind. She remembered the times her husband had nearly had an accident with the brick extruder. She remembered the neighbors' talk about how dangerous that machine was. A workplace accident. It would be the perfect cover. She said in a whisper full of conviction that there was only one way. They were going to stage an accident. John would have died in a workplace accident at the brickyard, not in the house. She laid out the entire plan for Leo. They would put John's body into the brick extruder and let the machine crush the part of his body with the stab wound, erasing all traces of a murder. But they could not do it right away. The sound of the machine in the middle of the night would surely arouse suspicion. They had to wait until dawn, John's normal working hour, then pretend to discover the body and scream for help. The plan was detailed, cold, and cruel, revealing the woman's extremely hardened criminal psychology. Leo, in his panic and with no other options, became an obedient puppet to Brenda's direction. The first thing they did was clean the crime scene. They used rags and buckets of water to wipe away all the blood from the bedroom floor and walls. Every trace of the struggle, of a murder, was carefully erased. The murder weapon was washed and put back in the kitchen. The blood-stained bedsheet was stripped and thrown into the washing machine. They worked in silence, coordinating as if they had rehearsed it before. After the house was clean, the next task was to move the body. They waited until nearly midnight, when the entire community was deep asleep, before they acted. Brenda got the heavy-duty wheelbarrow that John used daily to transport clay and bricks. Then the two of them, the wife who had just killed her husband, the man who had just killed his boss, together carried John's cooling body out of the house and placed it in the wheelbarrow. Brenda carefully covered the body with an old top, the kind used to protect bricks from the rain, disguising it as a normal load. Then began the most gruesome journey of the night. Leo, in front, strained to push the heavy wheelbarrow. Brenda walked alongside, her ears and eyes alert to any sound or movement. The squeaking wheelbarrow rolled through the dark, silent night, carrying a horrific secret from the house to the brickyard, about 500 yards away. The familiar village path now seemed endless and terrifying. Luckily for them, at that hour, there was not a soul in sight. The transport was successful. At the brickyard, they brought John's body inside and laid it next to the monstrous extruder. The plan was halfway complete. Now, only the final, most depraved part remained. But they had to wait. And so, for the nearly 4 remaining hours of that night, the two murderers sat beside the victim's body in the darkness and silence of the yard. They did not speak a word, each lost in their own thoughts. Leo trembled with fear. As for Brenda, perhaps she was thinking of a future of freedom, a new life with her lover, along with all the assets her husband had left behind. Their cold-blooded patience in that moment revealed a hardened and ruthless criminal mentality. As the first light of the new day began to streak the horizon, around 5 a.m., they knew it was time. Together, they lifted John's body and inserted his upper torso into the mouth of the extruder's hopper. Brenda was the one who flipped the switch. The machine roared to life, shattering the dawn silence. The steel auger began to turn, slowly pulling in the lifeless corpse. Horrific cracking sounds echoed as the machine ground into the victim's bones. Blood and tissue splattered everywhere. They let the machine run for only a few dozen seconds, just long enough to obliterate the stab wound in his abdomen, creating an undeniably gruesome accident scene. Then Brenda turned it off. Silence returned, but it was now more terrifying than before. The job was done. The crime seemed to have been covered up. They quickly switched to their final roles. Brenda ran outside and began to wail, screaming her husband's name in feigned despair. Leo pretended to run from the nearby kill area, acting shocked and horrified. Their performance had begun, an elaborate play designed to deceive everyone from the neighbors and relatives to the law itself. With the full and detailed confessions of both Brenda Peterson and Leo Martinez, the investigation phase of the case officially concluded. Every detail of the conspiracy, from the illicit affair and the spontaneous murder to the depraved plan to dispose of the body, was carefully documented in the case file. The initial circumstantial evidence from the scene was now perfectly linked with the killer's confessions, creating an irrefutable case. The Pennsylvania State Police completed their final investigative report and transferred the entire file to the Stark County District Attorney's Office, recommending that both suspects be prosecuted for murder. After a period of review, the DA's office issued an indictment charging Brenda Peterson and Leo Martinez with first-degree murder, citing numerous aggravating factors such as the commission of the crime in a cruel and depraved manner. Brenda Peterson was identified as the mastermind behind the cover-up plan. A few months later, the Stark County Court of Common Pleas brought the case to trial. Due to the particularly gruesome and depraved nature of the crime, the trial attracted significant media attention and public interest. From early in the morning, a large crowd of local residents gathered at the courthouse. They came to witness justice being served to the adulterous couple who had committed such a horrific crime. In the solemn courtroom, the two defendants, Brenda Peterson and Leo Martinez, stood before the judge, looking completely different from when they were first arrested. Leo Martinez was thin and pale. Throughout the trial, he mostly kept his head bowed, his shoulders trembling, clearly showing fear and belated remorse. In contrast, Brenda Peterson appeared completely emotionless. She stood straight, her face a cold mask, without a single tear or expression, her empty eyes staring into the distance. The hardened nature of this woman sent a chill through everyone present. In the gallery, on the bench reserved for the victim's family, John Peterson's elderly parents sat, their hair having turned white in just a few months. They wept silently. Every time the prosecutor recounted the atrocities their son had endured, they cried anew. The prosecutor began to read the indictment. The entire sequence of events was recreated in detail, from the initial anomalies at the scene that Detective Sergeant Miller and his team had discovered, to the illicit affair between the two defendants, and finally, their full confession of that horrific, fateful night. When the prosecutor described the act of the two defendants putting John's body into the brick extruder, a horrified silence fell over the courtroom, broken only by gasps of outrage and the sobs of the victims' relatives. During the questioning phase, faced with the irrefutable evidence and their own confessions, both Brenda and Leo admitted to their crimes. However, when asked about their respective roles, the blame game began once again. Leo Martinez claimed he was a passive participant, that he had only acted in self-defense when John attacked him, leading to the accidental death, and that the entire cover-up plan was orchestrated and directed by Brenda. In contrast, Brenda claimed that it was Leo who had initiated the attack and killed John out of jealousy, and had then threatened and forced her to participate in the cover-up. She tried to paint a picture of herself as a victim, a weak woman controlled by her lover. However, their clumsy and contradictory lies could not deceive the court. Based on the entire case file, especially the psychological and behavioral patterns of each defendant after the murder, their roles were clearly established. The closing arguments were brief. The defense attorney for Leo Martinez argued that his client's actions were spontaneous, committed in a state of extreme emotional distress, and that he had since confessed sincerely, hoping the court would consider a lighter sentence. The lawyer for Brenda Peterson had almost no defense to offer, only pleading with the court to consider that the defendant had a young child she was raising alone. In response, the prosecutor delivered a powerful rebuttal, rejecting all defense arguments. He emphasized that the defendant's actions were a calculated and inhuman series of acts, especially the disposal of the body with the brick extruder. This was not the act of someone in a state of distress, but the act of a cold-blooded killer, with preparation and a determination to conceal the crime at all costs. He requested that the court impose the strictest possible sentences, commensurate with the crimes committed, to serve as a deterrent and uphold the sanctity of the law. After the closing arguments, the two defendants were given a final statement before the jury's deliberation. Leo Martinez broke down in tears, tremblingly apologizing to the victim's family, his own parents, and begged the court for a chance to live and atone for his sins. As for Brenda Peterson, when asked for her final words, she maintained her cold silence. After a long pause, she said only one sentence, her voice flat and emotionless, stating that she had nothing to say. Her attitude extinguished any last hope of remorse. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. The judge announced the jury would now deliberate. More than an hour passed in tense anticipation. Finally, the door to the jury room opened, and the jury filed back into the courtroom. Everyone in the room stood up. The moment of judgment had arrived. The presiding judge, in a firm and clear voice, began to read the verdict. The courtroom was absolutely silent, everyone waiting for the final decision of justice against the two murderers. The judge stated that after a comprehensive review of the case file, the evidence, the testimony at trial, and the legal arguments, the court found this to be a murder case of a particularly egregious nature. He continued that the defendant's actions had caused immense pain and suffering, had created great outrage in the community, and must be dealt with in the strictest manner. The court rejected the defense's argument that the actions of defendant Leo Martinez were merely excessive self-defense in a state of emotional distress. The judge explained that the defendant was a young man of superior physical strength, who was fully capable of restraining or disarming the victim rather than taking his life. His actions displayed a thuggish and violent nature. As for defendant Brenda Peterson, the court found that she played the primary role in concealing the crime. After the murder occurred, It was the defendant who remained calm and masterminded the depraved plan to dispose of the body in order to erase evidence and deceive the investigation. The act of putting her own husband's body into a brick extruder was an act devoid of all humanity, a trampling of all moral and ethical values. The judge paused for a moment, looking directly at the two defendants standing with bowed heads. He declared that the actions of both defendants not only took a human life but also caused irreparable pain to the victim's family and negatively impacted the peace and order of the community. He deemed their crimes unforgivable and stated that they must be permanently isolated from society to ensure deterrence. Based on the provisions of the law, the court hereby sentenced defendant Leo Martinez to life in prison for the crime of murder. Hearing his sentence, Leo Martinez collapsed, his choked sobs echoing in the courtroom. Perhaps only now did he truly understand that the price for a few moments of lust and sin was a lifetime buried behind prison bars. The judge continued, his voice growing even sterner as he read the final verdict for defendant Brenda Peterson, sentencing her to death for the crime of murder. Even as the death sentence was pronounced, Brenda Peterson stood motionless. She did not cry, did not scream, did not collapse. She just slowly lifted her emotionless face, a terrifyingly profound silence about her. In the gallery, John's elderly parents broke into tears of pain, but also of relief that their son had finally been avenged. The trial ended. The two killers were escorted away by bailiffs. Leo Martinez stumbled away, sobbing, while Brenda Peterson walked with a calm, cold demeanor, leaving behind the contemptuous and disgusted gazes of everyone present. Outside the courthouse, Detective Sergeant Frank Miller lit a cigarette. He silently watched the crowd slowly disperse, buzzing with talk of the verdict. The case was officially closed. Justice had been served. But in the heart of the seasoned commander, there was no sense of victory, only a heavy burden. He thought about the nature of this case. It did not stem from a sophisticated, pre-planned conspiracy. It originated from something very mundane, an extramarital affair, a desire for physical gratification, a bit of material greed. He reflected on the old saying that an old flame and dry tinder will eventually catch fire, which perfectly described the beginning of the tragedy. But it was the psychology of the people involved that turned that spark of lust into a conflagration that consumed everything. A kind but somewhat submissive husband, not firm enough to resolve family conflicts decisively. A flirtatious, selfish wife who despised her husband. And a strong but weak-willed young man, easily led astray. These three people, these three personalities, formed a deadly triangle. But what haunted Sergeant Miller the most was not the fatal knife wound in the bedroom. A crime of passion in a moment of anger is something that happens. The most frightening, most disgusting part was what came after. It was Brenda Peterson's chilling composure as she devised the disposal plan. It was the act of the two lovers carrying the body of her husband, his boss, through the night. It was their patience as they sat beside the corpse for 4 hours waiting for dawn. And finally, it was the act of flipping the switch on the grinding machine. That was the moment that transformed them from spontaneous criminals into true demons. That was the moment that showed that the abyss of human depravity is sometimes deeper than one can possibly imagine. And in this tragedy, there was another silent victim, the young son of John and Brenda Peterson. The child had now lost his father forever, and his mother would pay for her crime with her life. Where would his future lead, growing up with such a horrific memory, a pain that could never be erased? Sergeant Miller took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling a plume of white smoke. He thought about the brickyard in Red Creek Township. It was probably abandoned now, overgrown with weeds. The old extruder, the silent witness to the crime, would likely be scrapped for metal. But its image would forever remain a warning, a reminder of the fragile boundary between man and beast, and of the terrible price to be paid when one decides to cross that line for lust and greed. The justice of the law had been served, but the justice of conscience would likely torment the living for the rest of their days. Through this case, we see the terrible devastation of an extramarital affair and the tragic consequences of weakness in resolving family conflict. The tragedy did not originate from a calculated plot from the beginning, but from the simmering cracks in a marriage where fidelity was trampled. The desire for physical gratification and contempt for one's spouse became fertile ground for crime to sprout. If the husband had been firmer, more decisive, the first time he discovered the betrayal, perhaps the tragedy would never have had a chance to occur. Misplaced forgiveness can sometimes be a condoning of evil, allowing it to continue its rampage, leading to irreversible consequences. The case is also a profound warning about the fragile boundary between man and beast. When cornered and blinded by greed, ordinary people can transform into cold-blooded demons. The depraved act of disposing of the body shows a break-less slide down the path of crime, where humanity has been completely destroyed, leaving only selfishness and cruelty. But the most painful lesson is the sacrifice of the innocent, especially the bleak future of the young child. He lost his father to his mother's lover's knife, lost his mother to the law's verdict, and will have to grow up with a horrific psychological scar that can never be erased. He is the most silent and pitiful victim. Finally, the case once again affirms the truth that all crimes, no matter how sophisticatedly concealed, will eventually be exposed to the light of justice, forcing the wicked to pay the appropriate price.